who's come in. Thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Aaron Rosenblum. I am the Health and Science Librarian here at the Portland Public Library. I'll be your host on Zoom this evening. And you can find me if you have questions. You can see you could send a direct message to me if you are having any problems with the Zoom or have a question about PPL or the program. This event is part of our, this might now be our 7th year of our sustainability series in collaboration with the Southern Maine Conservation Collaborative. We're usually joined by Jess Burton, the Executive Director of Southern Maine Conservation Collaborative, who unfortunately has another obligation this evening. You'll have to get by with just me. Jess will rejoin us next month. Our next program, in fact, I said next month because we're usually monthly. Our next one is in 2 weeks. It's on the 26th. We're very excited to welcome Zeke Crofton McDonald, who is the tribal ambassador for the Holton Band of Maliseets for tribal sovereignty and Wabanaki nationhood, past, present, and future. Right here on Zoom. The event is up on our website. If you get emails from Southern Maine Conservation Collaborative, those will be going out soon if they haven't yet. There will be Q&A and discussion after the main part of the program and the film premiere tonight. To participate in that, feel free to drop questions in the chat or in the Q&A function you may see on your Zoom screen. And we'll get to as many as we can in the time that we have. Before we go any further, we would like to offer PPL's land acknowledgement. Portland Public Library would like to acknowledge that the land on which we gather is the occupied and unceded territory of the Wabanaki, the people of the place where the sun first looks our way, who have stewarded this land throughout the generations. We extend our respect and gratitude to the many Indigenous people and their ancestors whose rich histories and vibrant communities include the Abenaki, Maliseet, Micmac, Passamaquoddy, and Penobscot nations, and all the native communities who have lived in Chuavunkeg for over 3,000 generations in what is now called New England and the Canadian Maritimes. We thank them for their strength and resilience in protecting this land and aspire to uphold our responsibilities according to their example. And because our talk this evening is so much about the sort of reality of some of that territory, I think that's especially important to offer. Tonight we're very excited to be hosting the premiere of a video from Maine Rivers about the Alewife run to China Lake, and we're really excited to be joined by Landis Hudson, who is the Executive Director of Maine Rivers, Jerry Monkman, who is the filmmaker and photographer who made the film, Matt Streeter, who is the Alewife Restoration Initiative Project Manager at Maine Rivers, and Nate Gray from the Maine Department of Marine Resources, Bureau of Marine Science, to talk about it. You'll see that they're featured in the film, and what I would love to welcome each of those folks to do is introduce themselves to you just a little bit, and then we'll introduce the film. So, on my screen, it goes Jerry, Landis, Matt, Nate. We don't have to stick to that, but it would work for me, Jerry.
Hi, I'm Jerry Monkman. I am the director and editor of the film you're about to see. I'm a conservation photographer and filmmaker based in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. And yeah, I've been doing work like this for about 25, 30 years now. So this was actually my second short film on Alewife Restoration, and I've learned so much. It's amazing, and you're going to see an amazing story tonight.
All right, and my name is Matt Streeter. I was the project manager on this project, and that means I was kind of the logistics person. I was involved with hiring and supervising the construction contractors, the engineers, preparing the permits, keeping the project on schedule, things like that.
Hi, I'm Nate Gray. I work for the Maine Department of Marine Resources. I'm a scientist with the Bureau of Sea Run Fisheries and Habitat, and I work on fisheries restoration. And I also had the utmost honor of working with Maine Rivers on this project, and I think you'll enjoy the film.
Great. My name is Landis Hudson. I'm the executive director of the nonprofit Maine Rivers. Thank you, Aaron. Thank you to the Portland Public Library for hosting this event. This is, of course, an international debut for our film. I don't know if you can see there is red carpet underneath me, maybe. But, so my organization, Maine Rivers, is a very small nonprofit. We're involved in all sorts of different efforts to improve the health and vitality of Maine's rivers. And as we worked on this project over many years, there were just so many stories that could have been told. And it was very exciting to be able to bring Jerry in at the end of a many year-long process that was so successful. And it was ultimately because of efforts from Nate and Matt that we were able to have a story to tell. So am I right, Aaron, that we're going to go directly into the film now?
We certainly can. Is that your last word before we do so?
Could be.
Okay, great. So I'll just say to all of you out there, we've had success streaming video through Zoom, but it can take a few seconds at the beginning for your computer to catch up and build a cache of what's coming at it. So if at the very first it's not looking great, take heart. It should resolve itself in a few seconds, and it's been looking great when we've tested it out. So here goes. I'm going to attempt to share the film, and we should all sort of mute ourselves over here so folks can just hear the film, and we'll see you in about 10 or 12 minutes, I think. Thank you for sharing that with us and premiering that with us, Landis and Matt and Maine Rivers and Jerry for making it. I think that the video does such a great job encapsulating sort of the stakes and the achievements and just showing the natural beauty of our state, and it sort of instantly gives you a buy-in to what might be important about this. But I wanted to sort of open up a discussion about sort of what it was like to sort of capture this, and if you want to add in any more history, then it's encapsulated there. And I think later on we could get to what happened since. And I also just want to remind folks, drop your questions in the chat, use the Q&A button, and we'll get to those. Yeah, but I mean, before we have any specific questions, is there anything that seeing the video now that you all wanted to sort of jump in and say, this was the best part, this was the hardest part, this is what I'm reminded of when I see this again?
I guess I'm just going to note that at one point, Nate is telling us his estimate for how many fish he thinks will come through the stream to the lake. And Nate, remind us how many you thought were going to come through, and then tell us what your actual number was.
Yeah, I gave a max estimate of 400,000, and I was half right. 835,000 fish came back this year. It was just epic is so cliche. It doesn't even come close. I mean, it was 6 weeks, a giant pile of fish came up that stream. It was just stunning.
Nate, oh, sorry, go ahead, Matt.
I was going to say, remind us how many eggs that means.
Well, it's a lot. I'll calculate out the number of eggs just so we can understand, wrap our heads around what we're really looking at here for numbers, because they get really, really large. I'm going to say 417,000 times 100,000 for the quick mathematicians in there. That's 41,700,000,000 eggs. It's a lot.
And I assume that itself, because obviously not every egg is successful, that some of those eggs become food for lots of other things in the lake.
Oh, yeah, it's just a giant smorgasbord. Everything from bacteria, you name it, it goes right up through the food chain. One of the things we've often said to folks is the attrition rate from egg to adult is enormous. Only about 1 in 50,000 will survive to adulthood, which tells you how much stuff eats them.
I don't think we mentioned in the film how important the Kennebec watershed is for alewives and river herring. And I was just reminded of that because I just started a project that's on a tributary to the Connecticut River. And I was looking at some of the alewife numbers there, and, passing the major dams in the Connecticut River, which is a huge river system, the longest in New England, we're talking a few thousand river herring some years, as opposed to millions in the Kennebec watershed at this point, which to me makes, even a relatively small stream like this outlet stream at China Lake super important to the survival of the species and the strength of the species.
And it is. Kennebec, as far as I'm aware, is home to the combined largest river herring run remaining in extant on planet Earth, where virtually almost all the watersheds on the eastern seaboard, for alewives went down to the Carolinas, for bluebacks all the way down into Florida and well up into the Canadian Maritimes for both. And, to understand that they've been reduced that much, and that the restoration work that has been performed on the Kennebec has taken it from just literally 100,000 fish that we could manage to catch and stock out. And then dam removals and fish passage installations. And now we have, very significant run of fish, probably the largest.
And one of the
Oh yeah, go ahead, Matt.
one of the things that Jerry, that your comment points to is the difference between doing a dam removal and doing a fishway.
Yeah.
Because on the Kennebec, having removed those two large main stem dams, results in, and China Lake is only one of the runs in that system. In the Sebasticook, I think they've had runs exceeding 5 million in the Sebasticook, on top of which now China Lake will be added. So that's the difference between taking down those two main stem dams and trying to build fishways on them, especially on a big river like that. I think our success rate in passing fish on this little stream is a lot higher than you would get on the Kennebec, because we can direct most of the water through the fishway.
Yeah, it was always an interesting part of the process for us talking to people in China and Vassalboro and other communities, because it's a part of Maine, and Maine is a part of the, a unique part of the world where the restoration potential is so huge. It's just vast. And I was talking to somebody earlier today who was recounting a conversation with somebody from Cape Cod, where they have runs that are 20,000 fish, and they feel proud of that. And here we are like, well, we thought it would be 400,000, but no, it's more like 800. So it's just an astonishing abundance. But at the same time, as you get pulled into the world of rivers and fisheries, your sense of time kind of collapses, because it used to be, to me, that 200 years ago seemed like a long time ago, and it doesn't anymore. My sense of time has changed, because you start thinking about the impacts that we've had on rivers in a different scale, over a longer timeline.
Yeah, and actually I'd love to, so first of all, we have some great questions coming in, and folks, we will get to those in just a moment. Before we do, I actually wonder if just exactly kind of on that time and historical view, a multi-part question for several of you. Nate, my understanding is that you've been in this business for a little while, and I wonder, how it's changed in the scale of your career. But I want to relate that out to Landis, what you just said about the history and culture in our region. Those dams and things look, but to my mind, they look the same way that stone walls in the woods in New England look to me, which is that having grown up with them, they almost seem a natural part of the landscape. They're so not, the walls and the dams, but we're so used to them. And so in a way, there's this cultural issue with removing them, which I think will come up. But and then I also just wondered if Jerry sort of, because you're now working in other places, I wonder if this looks the same in the other places you've worked on projects around this. If it looks like the history is the same, if it looks like the time scale is the same, and the culture part. But yeah, Nate, I mean, what have you seen change in this, just in a 20 to 30 year time scale or whatever it is?
That's a really, really good question. And I'll take it from a very personal level. When I first started with the department, all those millions of fish that we're currently talking about, we'd work literally 7 days a week, 10, 12-hour days to get 100,000 fish per season upstream into the Sebasticook prior to the removal of Edwards Dam in 1999. And I did that for several years, for about 7 years, in fact. And then once Edwards Dam was removed, we had already jump-started a whole bunch of fish passage projects on Sebasticook. And essentially what I'm telling you is we went from very few fish, a vestigial population existing almost solely in the lower Kennebec, to one of the largest, if not the largest in the world. I joke about it, but it's really not funny. When we saw a bald eagle on the Kennebec, we dropped our kit to stare at it when I first started. And now we have one of the largest, if not the largest, naturally occurring aggregation of bald eagles east of the Mississippi. And that's just in 30 short years. The recovery just across the board, just the species interaction that you see in the field that hadn't existed since 1837, as far as Edwards was concerned. We've seen harbor seals in Waterville, Maine, 70 miles plus from the ocean, in Benton, Maine. That's sight unseen by anybody alive today, and everything that goes along with it. Remarkable.
Amazing. Yeah. If they had known, they would have called them river seals. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I don't know, do any of you, Landis or Matt or Jerry, want to add any more of that sort of even longer scale, if you have it to talk about, or Jerry, just the comparison? Is there something different about New Hampshire, where I think you're working now on this question, this kind of stuff, in that long-term culture we're looking at?
I think it's very similar. I mean, almost, there's thousands and thousands of dams in New England, and they were kind of all built around that same 100-year period from the late 18th to the late 19th century, as part of the Industrial Revolution. So it's very similar. A lot of just old dams, most of them not really serving a purpose anymore, as Landis mentioned about the dams in the film on this project. So yeah, it's very similar. I mean, every river system's a little different, and every stream and tributary is a little different as to what kind of fish it can support. But as far as, culturally, I mean, it was all to harness that power of the water before we had Northeast Utilities and what are they called now? Eversource, yeah, to provide us with that power. That was kind of how we built the economies here. So now it's sort of the same process as deciding where can we safely remove these dams, where will they have an impact on improving wildlife and fish habitat.
Yeah, so Maine has a huge number of dams. Very few of them produce power. They have an outsized impact on native species, migratory species. It's hard not to be exasperated by it because they're just all over the place, up and down the coast. And I feel like Maine has a responsibility and an obligation as much as possible to reconnect our waterways because of this connection that we have to the Gulf of Maine. I guess I would also say there's another really important historical aspect to this, which I think is becoming much more widely understood, and that's that damming of our rivers was how the European colonists came and took over the land and the water, and that had tremendously negative impacts, obviously on the rivers and the fisheries, but on the people that lived here. And many of us have been inspired by work on the Penobscot River that was beneficial for the river and for members of the Penobscot Indian Nation that have seen the river come back to life and has tremendous cultural importance to them.
Yeah, and on outlet stream in particular, right at the outlet to the lake, there is a settlement there that goes back 9,000 years. There have been artifacts found going back 9,000 years, and people presumably, it may have been a seasonal settlement, but presumably in the spring, this was one of the first protein sources for people to subsist on, and in the fall, it may have been one of the last locations where they could get out migrating American eels. So it would have been a really important site in that frame of history. And then more recently, you know, as we were taking down some of these dams, a lot of people were concerned about the local history, the local colonial and industrial history. And there were people who would come up and say, well, my father worked at this mill, or my grandfather worked at this mill. The Massey sawmill was operational until 1973. It was running on a diesel motor, but it was still operational until 1973. So, and there was a real pride of the dignity of physical work that was tied up in all of that history. And we felt it was important to honor that history as well by, in each of the cases where we removed one of the dams, we tried to leave a remnant of the dam that was representative of the industrial history of the site. And I think that's an important thing to do. And I think people appreciate it when they come and see those sites today.
Yeah.
That said, the 6 dams that we worked with were only the few remaining. I mean, dams have come and gone, you know, they would be built and blow out in the spring, and, you know, looking into the history of what was going on in the 1800s, it's just astonishing how much people were, you know, setting up businesses and so much of it really was focused along the waterway.
Right, and Matt, to what you mentioned, I mean, it also, it crops up in the film in the sense of the mill building and dam owner who, you know, wanted to keep the popular dam. That's a popular photo spot and a charming part of his property. So, you know, it becomes not just a point of, you know, pride in the work that may have happened with the power in the mill powered by the dam with the stream, but just, you know, local culture and it becomes scenic as well, even though probably, I don't know whether it was thought of as scenic in the Industrial Revolution. I think a lot of that looks different in the 17th and 18th and 19th century than it does to us now. But I want to get to some of these questions from our attendees. We'll get through them, and we'll get to one which is a case of someone liking their dam and what it does for their waterway. But before that, we have a question from Bill, which is, might there be an estimate for the one-day maximum passage rate? And how did the fishways perform on peak passage days so far? Sounds like a Nate question, but
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think our peak day was about 140,000 fish at China Lake, where I had a counter installed. And I'd go and get the counts daily every morning, clean the counting array, and collect the numbers and write them all down and tally them up, and every day clean, because fish counters have to be clean. It was
Yep.
performance-wise, the fishways, let me just go back and say, these fishways, we call them technical fishways. Fish passage engineering has advanced significantly just in the past 50 years. The fishways performed remarkably well, and I can prove that out in a couple different ways. And certainly, if Bill wants to come see what I'm talking about, it's totally, you get it empirically when you look at it. Prior to the installation of fish passage at Outlet Dam, we'd have a train of fish literally 350 yards long, bank to bank, shoulder to shoulder. This spring, once the fishway was operational, that train of fish was almost indetectable, only because there was a fish passage there now, and they'd readily find it. It was very well designed. The attraction of the fish passage is right close to the attraction of the lake, literally a couple feet away, and the fish found it and swam right in. So there was no traffic jam of fish, and that was true of both the Lad Dam and as well as the lowest most fish passage, the Box Mill Dam. And also interestingly, a side note, the alewives show up on outlet stream remarkably early, and when you see where they occur in the system, they show up 3 weeks earlier than the fish at Weber Pond show up, which is significantly further downstream, and they show up significantly earlier than the fish show up at Benton Falls, which is only 5 miles upstream from the confluence with outlet stream into Sebasticook Lake. It was remarkable, and it's 2 years running that's occurred. We're really not sure why, but they show up earlier. And the fish passages, really performed admirably. We had some excellent engineers work on these things, and trust me, what you saw for the final build out was the best rendition of multiple renditions that were looked at every site.
Yeah. So it's kind of interesting, I think, to casual observers, when if you're lucky enough to go to a river in the spring and see a bunch of fish there, it might be really exciting and think, oh, look at all these fish, it's really neat. And then later, as you learn more and think about it, you realize that traffic jam is not so good. That while the fish are sitting there in the river, some of them are getting picked off by eagles and osprey, and their whole goal is to get up to the river and spawn. And as they're hovering there in the water waiting, they're burning up their energy. They're using their resources and have only come, in this case, 60 or 70 miles to get there. So it's, we might find it fascinating as an onlooker, but it may be treacherous or worse for the fish. And so not having the kind of cool to look at flotillas of fish trying to make their way upstream is better for the fish, because that means they're moving and not stuck in traffic waiting.
Yeah, that's so interesting, because it is such much of the attraction, right? Down here on Millbrook, Presumpscot, the whole idea, I mean, this is natural obstacle in this case, but hey, there's this natural obstacle, so all the fish have to form up so you can actually see them, because seeing one or two at a time is not very exciting. But yeah, it hadn't even occurred to me that that's not, I mean, I knew that it was not the best day for the fish, the day they have to get up this rock feature on Millbrook, but yeah, that it's actually dangerous for them, or unhealthy. So we have a short next question, but it relates to a longer, further question that came in. So I'd like to kind of run them together. From David, we got the question, what are some of the benefits to the lake itself for having the alewives return? And I'd like to embed that within a question from George, where that's part of the question, but I think it's why it's important, one reason it's important to talk about. So George says, we live and work on Washington Pond in Washington. The pond is very healthy, lots of fish, largemouth and smallmouth bass, perch, etc., beavers, mating bald eagles for the last 20 plus years. Also, water quality is very stable to support animal and plant diversity. The existing dam is critical to maintain the pond as is. The question that comes up for many as the fishway is contemplated is, aside from the reasons that alewives help less balanced bodies of water, what, if anything, can alewives bring to improve the already good quality of this pond? So again, to that first question was, what are the benefits of having alewives return? And more specifically, if a river or a pond appears to be doing well, what are they bringing?
Well, I think yeah, it's a great question, and certainly one we tried to have Jerry help us answer, so that we can encourage people to think of our waterways as being connected. Lakes are connected to rivers, which run to the ocean, and the healthier numbers of fish that can be supported in a river can improve insects, bird life. It really does strengthen the food web throughout an entire system. And I know from having grown up on a lake, we tend to think of lakes as being disconnected from the rest of reality and, being little places that we can connect, but they should be part of our landscape. And with that offer, so native species can build stronger webs for more vibrant wildlife of all kinds.
I guess this might relate also to extend it out, especially to fish that are more highly regarded than alewives. So we're talking about bass and perch and things that folks like to go out and catch. Some people like alewives. I like alewives. But I was wondering, I think I've read about this in some other cases where there's talk of restoration, that there's a game fish, I'm using the wrong terms, you can tell I'm not too much of an angler, are really established, and that if there's harm to that fishery, so I think that there's been some feedback from guides, from Maine guides, who are not looking forward to some of these changes. And I wonder, especially if any of you are anglers, kind of how you confront that, or if there's a reasonable, if it's reasonable to think that there might be a decrease in the population of some of these sport fish. That's the phrase I'm looking for, sport fish. Could this hurt, Maine guides or sport fishermen if they don't maybe adjust how they're looking at what they're out there catching and doing?
Yeah. Well, I'm gonna take a crack at that as a non-scientist, but as a fisherman. And the story I like to tell is, as we were building that fishway at the outlet to the lake, every morning we'd go down there a little before 7 a.m. The construction crew would be showing up, and there was a daily rhythm to the activity around the dam, and that was, first thing you would see, a cormorant would come cruising in and start eating alewives, because the juvenile alewives toward the end of the summer are circling near the exit. And so the first thing in the morning was a cormorant, and that cormorant would come in and get his or her fill of fish. And the second thing was a family of ducks would come in. And I forget what species of ducks, I don't know ducks, but they would come in and they'd sit there and they'd gobble up alewives and they'd get their fill. It was a mother and a half dozen little babies that grew and grew and grew over the summer. And then the third thing that would come in, or really that was there all along, is big, fat, honking bass, just sitting there, gobbling up alewives as much as they could possibly stuff themselves with. And the last thing that would come in every morning was a guy on his bass boat with his son fishing for the bass. I mean, I'm no scientist, but it was clear to me that the introduction of alewives into China Lake was going to do nothing but boost the bass population and the sport fish population. And as an aside, there was a guy who would come up who fished down for striped bass on the Sebasticook, where the Sebasticook goes into the Kennebec, and he would come up every day or every couple of days before he'd go fishing. He'd come up and see how many alewives were coming out, and that was just part of his routine for fishing, because he wanted to see what the fishing was going to be. The striped bass fishing was going to be like down on the Kennebec. So as far as sports fish go, scientists will hem and haw on this question some, because it's very hard to say that there is data that would be publishable on it, right? But for a common sense approach for a person who fishes, it appeared to me to be nothing but good for the fishery.
Great. And yeah, so George, thank you for that question.
And as a little addendum to that,
yeah,
the alewives don't eat the same food that the bass eat. The
Okay.
alewives eat phytoplankton. So although some species of juvenile fish may at some stages be in competition with alewives for food, it's not they're not really directly in competition.
and that's perfect. That was the content of a follow-up question from George about whether tens or hundreds of thousands of additional fish would result in degradation due to greater competition for the food the fish consume. So I think we've got that one. We have one more question that's come in, and I hope people will keep adding them. I have some ones I'd like to get to too, but Bill also asked, is there anyone talking about fish passage at Pioneer and Waverly?
Good question, Bill. Now we're talking about it. Waverly and Pioneer, I think Bill knows some things just because he used the name of the first two dams in correct order on the west branch of the Sebasticook. And that west branch of the Sebasticook goes up into Great Moose and Big and Little Indian ponds, thousands upon thousands of acres of primetime habitat. These bodies of water also happen to occur above the fish passage facility at Benton Falls, which is a fish lift. The fish lift, if you keep up with the numbers every year, we're averaging about 3 million fish per year at Benton Falls. We've had as high as 5.7 million, and we've, but we're trending at about 3 million fish per year, give or take. And that's with an active fishery below Benton Falls. And it's important to understand that fishery fishes about 4 days a week. We have 3 days of escapement. There are so many fish below Benton Falls that the fish lift goes up and down like a yo-yo as fast as it can every day. 7 days a week, from sun up to sundown. It goes up and it goes down. About every 5 minutes and 12 seconds, it completes a cycle in daylight. The fishway is undersized. And we've batted that around inside. How do we, if we pursue fish passage, and we will at Waverly and Pioneer dams, both of which are relatively high head dams, by the way, that increase in production, we need to put 3 fishways in of some form or another, Waverly Pioneer, or Pioneer Waverly, and Great Moose, and subsequently Big and Little Indian, but those would probably be last. Just the addition of Great Moose would add another additional at least 1 million fish to the run that would now be approaching Benton Falls. And again, 3+ million. That license is coming up in the not too terrible future, and we're going to have to revisit that as far as capacity. So Bill, yes, we have looked at fish passage options for both Pioneer and Waverly. I've done some public outreach up at Great Moose, but right now, we have passage capacity issues downstream, and we're as fast as we can go right now. So that's kind of a complex answer to a very complex question. And that's the truth of it.
Great. I actually wanted to pivot a little bit from the science and the dams and the policy to Jerry. First of all, like every shot is fantastic. The nature shots, the drone shots, the interviews are really nicely framed as well. Again, great car that guy has in his mill. But I wonder if you'd talk a little bit about the experience of doing what you do in that landscape, in the watershed, some of the beautiful nature shots of the heron nest and that otter, the incredible close up of that otter towards the end, I guess. But yeah, I mean, what was it like, on location along this waterway? It's not the St. Lawrence River, I don't think you would have, I assume there's no part of this waterway that is really taller than you, except right above some of those dams. So I don't picture that you needed a submersible or anything. But I'd love to hear about, how you made it look so great, other than the fact that it's a beautiful place. But
Yeah. I'm glad it looks good. That's good to know. Yeah, I mean, this stream was challenging just because there's not a lot of public access. I mean, it's relatively short compared to a lot of rivers in Maine, and it's it has an industrial past. It's been basically going through people's backyards and through towns. So that's one reason we used a lot of drone footage, because it's easier to fly a drone up above the river than actually walk down along it in places. For me, it was just, it's just, I guess the excitement of seeing all the fish really sort of kept inspiring me to keep finding ways to tell that story and try to make it somewhat, compelling, make it look like it felt to me. And we used for the underwater shots, we just used the GoPro camera on a painter's pole, believe it or not. We dip it into the water. But I really was excited to show the Massey mill site, especially the former sawmill site, where they did a complete dam removal. We didn't really get to talk about it in the film, but Matt's been working with the local community to start restoring the banks there. You might have seen what looked like small saplings planted on there, but to actually go there where there's not a dam and still see a lot of fish was super exciting to me. And that's something I really wanted to portray in the film, and to be able to capture that, show the fish and the former sort of mill building in the background all at the same time. I don't know. It was inspiring to me to see this site that used to just be sort of this, bedded, backed up pond behind it, now turned into this fast rushing stream filled with fish finding their way up to China Lake. So, I started as a landscape still photographer, and that's still sort of my way of kind of approaching most shots. So I'm always kind of looking for that grand kind of epic look to things. And I think that comes through in almost everything I film, because it's just how I kind of see the world.
when did you first start working with drones? They still seem new to me, but I don't follow the technology that closely.
Yeah, I mean, they're still relatively new to me too, but it's been, I think, 4 or 5 years. I could tell based on old projects that have no drone footage in them at all. I'm like, wow, I didn't use a drone on that. But yeah, I think I first started shooting with them about 4 years ago. I used them extensively on a feature-length film I did on the Merrimack River a couple of years ago. And then now it's almost every project, whether it's film or still photography that I do in New England now, we use drones as part of part of the process. It's just so easy to get up and get a great sort of overview of things that, I used to do aerial photography in planes and helicopters, and we'd sometimes spend $1,000, $1,500 an hour to do that. And I think now, like, a little film like this, our aerial photography budget might have ended up being about $50,000, and I'm pretty sure we never would have done it if that was the case.
Right. I think about that now, just if I see what's clearly a drone shot in a film, or more when I'm watching an old movie and I see what is clearly a helicopter or airplane shot, and I just, because in my mind now what it goes to is cool drone shot. Oh no, wait, they go up in a helicopter to film this, and then if they didn't go, and you could tell sometimes because all the trees are moving around because it's a helicopter, which only works if it's a movie with helicopters in it. Like, oh, apocalypse now, fine, the trees are shaking. But yeah, that's really neat. That you've been able to do so much thanks to that technology to make this film sort of able to do so much more for so much less.
Yeah, I mean, it's from a photographer perspective, it's kind of weird. It's kind of like I have it's sort of like playing a video game as opposed to actually filming, which is what I feel like when I'm in an actual aircraft, but at the same time, it's so much safer. I don't worry about crashing when I'm flying a drone. Well, I do a little, but I don't worry about dying. Worry about my $1,500 drone.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, and folks, again, if you still have more questions, feel free to put them in the chat or the Q&A. I was wondering, I think this is kind of Landis and Nate. Obviously, the state and Maine Rivers collaborated in ways on this, and I assume in lots of projects. But I kind of wondered about some of those differences or complementary ways in which you're able to work, because Nate, I assume you are bound by certain aspects of what the state is mandated to do, and Landis on the other side, things that Maine Rivers might like to do but is not empowered to do because you're not the government entity. So how does that work? It seems like it's working for good right now. Has it always been able to be positive?
Well, this was a hugely collaborative project. So central to it, of course, was Nate and his vision and his experience coming from working for the Department of Marine Resources. But, we really listened to Nate along the way over the many years that we worked on this. But we did also work with Weber Pond Association, the China Lake Association, the Sebasticook Regional Land Trust, teachers from the schools in China and Vassalboro, town managers in Vassalboro, and Mary Sabins was in the film, as well as people from China. So we had help from NRCS, from the Fish and Wildlife Service. They were really central. So anybody that looked like they could be helpful, we grabbed them and brought them into the process. And it was, it was kind of unusual because there were so many different parts to it and so many different sites and, so many different needs and requirements that we had to figure out along the way. So it's one thing, like if somebody hands you a script and you just say, oh, okay, this is everything I have to do, or hands you a recipe and you say, oh, I'm just going to go shopping and buy all the stuff and cook it. We were very much figuring it out along the way. And it took, a lot of, I think I mentioned in the film, patience and perseverance, but also figuring out what each of the different entities could bring, and then also what they couldn't bring. So, I mean, Nate has obviously a lot of experience and wisdom, and works for the Department of Marine Resources in the state, and can bring a lot of practical support to the effort. And then, you know, Maine Rivers is just this tiny little nonprofit. All we had to do was like raise the money to to make it all happen, you know? So, yeah, we were kind of figuring it out along the way. And, you know, there were other people that brought in really significant parts of the equation at different steps along the way. Is there anything you would add to that? I mean, it's kind of hard to describe because each site, each of the 6 different sites where we worked was like its own epic journey. It was like its own
It really
story.
was. There were so many different levels to this thing. And what you find out when you work on any sort of restoration project, particularly one that involves a dam removal or a fish passage installation, or any sort of perceived change to the way things are. You know, the reintroduction of historically present fish, you know, every possible thing that you could think of that would come out of the woodwork did. And working with all the partners that Landis referenced and working with Maine Rivers, I can tell you this right now with great level of certainty that there would be no alewives free swimming into China Lake at this stage, not for many years to come, without that partnership, without working together. We're far more powerful that way. You know, it was a hugely mutually beneficial symbiotic relationship, and everybody brought as much as they possibly could to the table and to see it through. And I'll just say that it is remarkable to pull off these many projects in such a short period of time. It was truly astounding.
Yeah,
Knowing how-
I was just gonna say, Matt and I had many conversations over the years as we would kind of figure out like, okay, this is what we've got to do this year. That's what we're gonna do next year? Are you kidding? How are we gonna do that? But usually that was really? You think we're gonna get that done next year? And, you know, we pretty much always did. And sometimes more, but it was like some sort of crazy Olympic event, you know, and, you know, we'd do it. And then we had to like figure it out all over again from scratch. And one of the things that we kind of started saying, you know, to each other and then to people in the community, at one point, the fish were ready and we just had to work to keep up with them. We saw they were coming back and they were ready. We just had to like get our act together and like raise all the money, get the permits, get all the engineering done so we could keep up with them. And that was a little bit abstract, but then in the final bit, it wasn't abstract and we didn't want a huge number of fish coming back and, you know, getting stuck somewhere or not being able to make it to the lake. So in the film, Jerry captured footage of people using nets and moving fish over the final dam, the China Lake Outlet Dam. And that sounds sort of kind of, oh, cool, moving fish in nets over a dam. That's kind of like a heartwarming thing. But no, it was not heartwarming. And we really knew we had to make sure we could get everything done the next year because we didn't want to be doing that again. Like Matt and Nate, how many fish were you guys moving?
Down there, we'd move about 25,000 fish. You know, that completed our stocking requirement and, you know, what the permit allowed. And it took a couple days to do it and several people and, you know, small hat, big neck, you know, the old school. And we've done it this way for decades, you know, get them started. But Landis is right, you know, once you start the machine, you best be having provisions to let the machine run in the end of it, you know, so either take out a dam or put in a fish passage.
Yeah, and each year, the way it worked out, each year kind of, we set ourselves up for a more and more challenging project each year. So, and the pressure went up every year.
Yeah.
But as we got toward the end, it also became more and more certain that we were going to succeed, because at the beginning it was not altogether clear that we were going to get all the way through all 6 projects.
Yep.
So,
I remember, Jerry, when you were interviewing me for the film, and I was kind of stunned because there are these like thousands of fish going by, and you said, how did you guys know it was going to work? How did you know you were going to be able to do it? I don't know what I answered, but
Well,
we knew we wanted to.
I mean, so that we do have another question that came in from George there in Washington. That sort of relates to that sureness, or that you can project that sureness that it'll work. I wonder if any property owners expressed reluctance at letting their property be modified, i.e. removal or modification of the dam. Though it worked on the current project, what can one do to bring along reluctant, no confrontational property owners? Is there any legal recourse? And I don't know whether George is asking which direction that legal recourse might be for you to take, or for the landowners to take.
Well, yeah, that was a lot of what we did, was spend time talking to people, and before I became involved in the project, some of the skeletal outlines of how things could happen were in place, but we spent in some cases years talking to people to try and figure out how we could make something happen in a way that would be acceptable to them. And one of the last sites that we worked on had a kind of washed out remnant of a dam that we thought fish could get past, but we really didn't like the idea of having thousands and thousands and thousands of fish kind of stuck at this last remnant of a dam. And luckily we were encouraged by one of our funding partners to rebuild a bridge right next to the crumbled dam. The abutments of the bridge were collapsing, and the people that lived next to it were, basically we were able to build a bridge and remove the dam. And that was a great benefit for them. And we were really happy to know the fish could scoot past an area that had been a pretty serious barrier. So this is a lot of what we had to do, was talk to people and try and figure out how we could find a solution at each site. But in the film, Ray Breton owned 2 of the sites where we ended up building fishways. And we had, at the first site, the Box Mill site, we had how many different renditions from engineers? Like 6?
Yeah. Yeah.
So we had a lot of, so we were trying to figure out what would be most efficient for the fish and what would be acceptable for the property owner. And, I remember very clearly the first time somebody drew up a design and Ray looked at it and said, nope. And
Not
then
this
we showed
one.
it. What's that?
Not this one.
Not this one. Yeah. And, we had those conversations over and over again with him until we finally got to something that worked. So that's how we did it.
yeah, in the end, there were some property owners who were very eager to be rid of a liability. And there were some who were really attached to their dams and didn't initially want to lose them. And you ultimately have to have that conversation and keep talking it over and decide what you can both agree on, because he asks, is there any legal recourse? There's relatively little in the way of kind of coercive law about this in Maine. And so even if there were, it would be very poisonous to kind of the relationship with not just that individual, but with the whole community, to try and use that. So it would be a last resort. And we were fortunate that we had a lot of people with a lot of different talents in the group who could all not only contribute to the project as a whole, but contribute to communicating with the dam owners, because sometimes the dam owner wants to hear what the impact on brook trout is going to be. And sometimes the dam owner wants to know, how it's going to affect the banks of their stream and things like that. And so we had so many partners who had so much varied knowledge that we could answer just about any question that came at us. And that was really helpful.
Thanks.
But, yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, but there's also not the case that you could just hit a button and have it go. I mean, it took a lot of conversations, and each site was unique, and the people we were dealing with were also unique. So we had to understand the site and get to know people and figure out what their interests were.
Yeah. So what I would love to do, I don't see any new questions. I think it would be great to go around and hear, the next steps or hopes, or Jerry, I don't know how much you can say about the film you're working on now on a different waterway, but where does this work go for Maine Rivers? Is it to a different river? Is it further work on this river to maintain it? Nate, is there a broader state plan to move this along in different waterways? Matt, who are you talking into wonderful things and arranging for now that it's not Vassalboro, or are you still having to do work along this path? Yeah, I think that would be a great way to head towards a close here. We don't have to, but yeah, what's next for everybody?
Well, it's in Vassalboro, I always felt like it was important to leave things better than when we arrived, and so we're still doing a lot of work on the riparian buffer zone in the places where we remove the dams. It's a huge opportunity to manage for invasive plant species and replace those species with native species, so that you have a really healthy ecosystem along the stream shores. And luckily, some of our funders provided that funding to continue that for 5 years after the dam removal. So we are continuing with some of that in the community. And as far as future projects, Landis can talk about what we're doing in Maine Rivers. We are looking at a couple different potential projects. Non-Maine Rivers right now in Naples on the Crooked River, I'm working with Trout Unlimited to do a partial dam removal of a very important historical dam right there, and working through all the logistics with the local historical society, so that maybe in 2023, 2024, we'd take that remnant out. And then there are culverts all over the state as well that are uncontroversial, but really important.
Yeah. And I guess for my perspective, what I really appreciated in working with Jerry to help us tell the story was that he showed the beauty and success of bringing this fish back, and allowed us to give a sense of the ecological importance. And so we're intentionally telling a story of success, because it is possible, and it was possible. And I am motivated by that, but I'm also honestly motivated by the fact that our numbers of native migratory fish are at historic lows, which is a pretty terrifying idea, that we're at something like 5% of numbers of this critical component of life. So while I'm happy to have been a part of something that was so successful, I'm also motivated by a certain level of fear, because I see a lot of our ecological systems are really on the brink, and we're increasingly aware of the perils of climate change. So I'm thinking of the many communities where this kind of work should happen up and down the coast. The St. Croix River is a huge waterway that has tremendous potential for millions and millions of fish. The Penobscot had tremendous amounts of work, and it's just really getting started. The Kennebec is right now a giant headache that needs to be fixed. It needs to be resolved. 4 main stem dams owned by giant company that is not allowing a sense of vision or ecological health for that tremendously important watershed. The Cobbessy watershed, also tremendous potential there, and it needs to be fixed and opened up. Smaller watersheds in coastal Maine, the Royal, the Mousom, we have so much potential and so much need.
Yeah, and speaking of Cobbessy, I wanted to mention that last year, the way Landis and I met was I made a similar film with some overlapping cast of characters
Yeah.
on Cobbessy Stream, for a small group there called Upstream that's working on fish restoration there. And that's very much a project in process, with 3 dams that could open up a even bigger watershed than China Lake. And I was really excited to do this film this year to show that you can have success, and that working on a stream like Cobbessy is worth the effort and the pain and the headaches. I'd also like to mention that the Penobscot, which you've mentioned, they do a lot of work for the Appalachian Mountain Club. And for those of you who don't know, the Penobscot, they're spent $50 million removing or creating fish passage around 4 main stem dams. Is that correct? I think.
Yeah.
3. And now there are actually Atlantic salmon spawning in the 100-mile wilderness on the Appalachian Mountain Club's property on the west branch of the Pleasant River. Way, I don't know how many miles that is from the ocean. 100 miles probably. And it's a very small amount, but it's showing that there are, reasons to be hopeful that this type of work can result in real progress in restoring some balance to our waterways.
Great.
Yeah.
Nate, what's the view from Marine Resources for the future?
Well, this is kind of the mile high view, the big perspective picture from where I'm coming from Marine Resources. This is what I've done for the past 30 plus years, worked on one form of restoration or another. And in working at Marine Resources, we always have our ears to the wire of the other fisheries, principally the marine fisheries in the state, and subsequently nationally or on the eastern seaboard. And we've all seen it. We don't need to review it exactly right here, but we've basically seen the collapse of the vast majority of our commercial fisheries at sea. Almost all of them. And strangely enough, coincidentally, the declines began about the same time the declines in these river herring populations started happening, many of these fish. Was it cause and effect, or just sympathetic? But I think there's a connection. We remove a keystone species like this from an ecosystem, and that ecosystem begins to unravel. You add on all the additional pressures of what we applied to New England during the Industrial Revolution, including just massive increases in effort on fisheries, and seeing that we're able to restore some degree, in this case, a very successful degree, the vast potential of these runs of fish provides me what I think today is really important, a little bit of hope that we can do this. And, just seeing what I've seen as far as the ecological impacts of this fish, is beyond all scope. I never imagined that it was this complex, and it truly is. Just a remarkable thing, and we are capable of doing it, and it needs to be done. These machines need to be put back together. That's what they are. These all lakes that are disconnected either through dams or bad fish passage or no fish passage or we've unplugged almost all of them, when in fact in the springtime they're really supposed to breathe in, and in the fall time they breathe out, just like people do. And most of the lakes in Maine have been holding their breath for a long time, and it's time to get them breathing again. So
Thank you for that. And I think that's that note of hope and sort of the challenge ahead is a wonderful note to end on. I'd really just love to thank you, Landis and Jerry and Matt and Nate, on behalf of the Portland Public Library and the Southern Maine Conservation Collaborative, and the folks who joined us, or who might see this later online. Yeah, and we'll be back in 2 weeks on the 26th. A really great presentation, the next in our sustainability series. Meanwhile, everybody make your plans now for next spring to go watch some alewives. Hopefully not in huge numbers, because we learned that that's a bad thing, but you can still see them going upstream, even in smaller numbers, and that's a good thing. So again, thank you all, and have a great evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks,
all.